Good morning, everybody. I have Senator Black with us today. Today, we normally talk about foreign policy and other worldly events, but today we're going to keep it home and discuss something that is rather personal to Senator Black. We've referred to it on the show, which is the aspect of educating our kids and education as a whole. So, without further ado, I want to shift it to you, Senator Black. So you can start us off.
Good morning, Morgan. Thank you for hosting the show. Yeah, I think we're going to be talking about federal protections for unruly students and how that's putting good kids at risk, and it's literally collapsing the public education system in the country. It's important because our culture is only going to be so sound. It's one thing to be fighting wars all over the globe, but we've got huge problems domestically that we better come to grips with sooner or later. The heart and soul of what we're talking about here is really it's a tumor in the public education system, and it goes way back. Now, just to give you some background on me, I served for 8 years in the Virginia House of Delegates and 8 years in the Virginia Senate. And during all of those years, I was on the Education Committee and always just frustrated. What is going wrong with our schools, and what can we do to fix them? And actually, it was considerably after I was out of office before I discovered what the fundamental problem with our educational system is. And I mean, there are many, many problems, but there is something that's so destructive built into the system that there's really very little that public education, public teachers unions don't care at all about education, but the teachers do. But even the state legislators cannot do much, because this is sort of a time bomb that was planted by a heavily Democrat Congress back in 1975, and it is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it goes by the term IDEA, which the letters of it, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. Now this bill was passed back in 1975. Gerald Ford was the president, but it was kind of odd. After Nixon was pushed out of office, the Democrats essentially had their choice of who the Republican president would be. Gerald Ford was a very amiable Republican, not very strongly philosophical. He was kind of a go along, get along guy, and that's what they wanted, because they wanted a president who would do what they told him to do. Gerald Ford was the perfect guy for that. Now, in 1975, when this bill was enacted, the Democrats had just a gargantuan majority in the House and Senate. This was right after Watergate. It was at the time that the Vietnam War was collapsing, the civil rights movement was raging, riots in the streets and so forth. It gave the Democrats enormous power. So in the House, they had a majority of 273 votes against 198 Republican votes. So they could pass anything they wanted. In the Senate, almost a 2/3 majority. They had 61 Democrat senators, and there were only 38 Republicans. And so there was a total collapse of any authority on the right. There was nothing to counterbalance what they did. So they passed this Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And it was at a time there was, I don't know, kind of this movement about, well, disabled people, we need to accommodate them. And people thought, well, okay, that sounds like a good idea. Honestly, people had always been accommodating disabled people to the extent they were able. I mean, people are just very sympathetic. So when the act was passed, it was sold on this idea that, hey, look, we've got kids who are in wheelchairs. They ought to be in class with their classmates. How about a child who's blind or who is deaf? Can't we do something to integrate them into the classroom? Now, the fact is, they'd always been integrated into classrooms, but people agreed, okay, well, we can sort of re-emphasize the importance of this. Sounds good. Everybody would agree with that these children should be brought into the classroom. Well, the true to form, the Democrats have a tremendous focus on criminal elements. And one of the things that they did is under this, they classified children who were mentally disabled as being eligible for this program and protected by these laws. And to an extent, that's not a problem if you're talking about, well-behaved people who have Down syndrome or so forth. During the COVID time when I was teaching children in our Senate office, I had a fellow who was Down syndrome. He was considerably older than the children in the class, but he was well behaved and he seemed to enjoy being in a class, and it just was not a problem. But that was not the issue. The issue is that you had Democrat psychologists, psychiatrists who came together and said, well, certain misbehavior is a disability. So you would take children who had severe behavioral problems that often made them dangerous to their teachers and their classmates, and they were classified as being, mentally disabled. Well, the fact is they were not. They were street thugs, they were hoodlums, they were criminals and violent people. And so anyway, this special education program, this Federal Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, became the law, and it extended protections to very, very bad elements in the schools. And so what it said is that a child who was disabled, to the extent possible, had to be integrated into classroom with children who were not disabled. And so this has become a very severe problem, and it's been exacerbated by these DEI restorative discipline problems, where the left has said, look, all groups must be identical. So if we have a group with a very high crime rate, we have to remake it by punishing more of the people who are not in a high crime area, or we do things to manipulate the numbers or whatever. But statistically, everybody has to be equitably dealt with. Well, the problem is that keeps you from identifying individual problems and rooting those out and keeping law and order. So this moves to a case that has just gone to trial. It goes back to 2023. This is when this happened. But out in Newport News, in Rich Neck Elementary School, there's a young first grade teacher, Abby Zwerner, and she had an extremely violent and dangerous 6-year-old child who just hated people. Uh, I don't know why he hated her so much. She was a delightful teacher who loved her students, but who knows? She was white, he wasn't. Um, I don't know. I have no idea what got him into this. But anyway, this boy brought a 9mm handgun to school, and everybody knew he had it. He shared it with one of his playmates during recess, pulled out the gun, said he was going to shoot his teacher, and then he warned the other boy. He said if you squeal on me, I'm going to kill you. And the boy knew he would kill him because this was the type of kid this was. This was a boy who had a record, and these rumors got to the teachers. There were members of the staff, other teachers or teachers' assistants, so forth, and everybody had heard. There's a boy with a gun, got it out for his teacher. He's going to use it, and so anyway, this was conveyed to the principal, the assistant principal at the teacher, a woman named Ebony Parker, and the boy had a history. Now, this boy had a history of criminal aggression, of hurling objects around the classroom, threatening the other teachers, and grabbing his teacher from behind and choking her. This was an extremely violent child. And so the teachers warned the assistant principal that this boy had a gun. He intends to use it. And one of the I think it was a male teacher who said, "Hey, look, how about if I just search the kid and see, do you have a gun or don't you have a gun?" And that request was not viewed favorably. The assistant principal, Ebony Parker, said, "Well, the boy's pocket's probably too small for a gun." And she refused to allow anybody to take any action. It was near the end of the school day, and apparently she was just hoping nothing will happen, it'll all blow over. Now, because of her refusal to act, the boy pulled out the gun in class with all of his classmates there and fired and hit his teacher, attempting to kill her. No doubt he was attempting to murder his teacher. And he fired the bullet. The bullet went through her hand and through her chest. The bullet almost pierced her heart, and it is still lodged in her body today. She has some permanent damage. The nerves in her hand were injured, and so predictably, Abby Zwerner, who after she was shot and almost mortally wounded, she staggered out, moving her children out of the classroom away from this boy to safety before she collapsed unconscious. Now, if this was some isolated incident, maybe that would be one thing. But the reason for this occurring is that teachers and administrators know that under this Federal IDEA Act, if they remove or attempt to remove a child from the classroom, they first must go through this enormous Byzantine series of processes and evaluations and so forth. And that if there's one of these public interest attorneys who gets involved, he can tie them in knots. He can impose great legal costs on the school. And basically, an attorney who uses all of the tools he can against the public school can just simply exhaust them and tie them in knots. So my guess is that this Ebony Parker, at least one motivation may have been fear of the consequences of her inability to work through all of these procedures. They're very vexatious, very complex, and almost unintelligible to work your way through. Now, the IDEA's disciplinary rules prohibit the punishment of disruptive children. And now, it can't just be any disruption. It has to be some disruption that can be classified as a manifestation of a disability. But psychologists are very good at classifying things and pigeonholing them to where they become a disability rather than just simply criminal behavior. And if they are believed, if it's believed that they might possibly fit into one of these categories, then you go into hearings, assessments, procedural checklists, potentially litigation, appeals, and so forth. And meanwhile, all the while all of this legal process is underway, these disruptive hoodlums remain in the class. Now, here's how bad it is. There are certain categories of violent behavior that are included in something called intermittent explosive disorder. Now, think about it. Psychologists have classified criminal misbehavior as intermittent explosive disorder. This is legally protected under federal IDEA legislation. So if you have a child who unexpectedly leaps to his feet, clenching his fist, cursing at the teacher, and hurling furniture across the room as his classmates duck under their desks for protection, that child is untouchable until you first carry out a series of complex, drawn-out formal procedures and potentially get involved in litigation and appeals and so forth. So the IDEA Act, the Federal IDEA Act, puts the interests of disruptive, antisocial elements above the rights of well-behaved children to study in a safe, conducive environment. Now, the disabilities law that we're dealing with, the IDEA Act, then dovetails with the very soft discipline under DEI. Good example of this, they have restorative justice programs. Restorative justice programs are when somebody does some criminal act in a school, you want to, under the idea of equity, every group, every racial group has to be the same. So restorative justice programs are put in place to reduce statistical disparities for suspensions among various racial groups. And in practice, what happens is you simply don't suspend bad kids. If you have too many in one racial group versus another, you got to balance it out. So you just retain those kids, and you say, okay, well, we're going to restore you. We're going to say, be good tomorrow, and there won't be any consequences. Now, in practice, as restorative justice has taken hold of public schools, you have a tremendous upsurge in serious incidents. And in New York City, the number of such incidents was 1,200 in the year 2016. And by 2025, it had gone from 1,200 to 4,000. So you can see, you can almost sense the disintegration of order and functionality of the public school system in New York City. You can imagine what's going to happen now that we've got Mandami. Lots of the things Mandami, who just won as mayor in New York, many of the things that he's promised can't be accomplished because the state law doesn't allow it. But he will be able to very strongly affect the way that the schools are run. And the schools in New York City are already disorderly, violent, dangerous places. And you can anticipate that under Mandami and all of the people who come in under him, that you're going to see an increase in disorder, because that is something that just by virtue of the things he's expressed on the campaign trail, those will be implemented even without him taking any formal action. So we're going to see that breakdown of order in the New York City schools exacerbated. Now, when these restorative justice programs were implemented in New York City, a survey of the teachers reported that the school administrators were discouraging them from removing violent students from the classrooms. And so you had the federal IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, dovetailing with this DEI program and just making it impossible for the teachers to maintain order and discipline. We can see this played out also in Baltimore. Baltimore is where I was born. And fortunately, family moved out when I was just a tyke. But in Baltimore, there's been some very good reporting on this. And just recently, 40% of Baltimore's high schools have reported that there are 0 students in their student bodies that are proficient in math. Do you think about that? An entire high school, and there's not one child who rates proficient in math. Now, certainly, some students, I don't care how troubled a school is, I don't care how bad the neighborhood is, certainly within a student body of a high school, there are going to be some students who are capable of achieving proficiency, even in the very most challenging schools anywhere in the country. But I'm convinced that dangerous elements are forcing good kids to avoid school altogether. Baltimore City schools experienced a 45% truancy rate uh, between 20 in the school year 2023 and 2024. Think about that, 45%. And my guess is that many of those who are not coming to school are doing it out of fear. I think they're fleeing the schools and they're prioritizing their physical survival and their lives over academics. If you know, the first thing you do, you've got to live, and if you can't survive, then being able to read and write are not of great importance. Um, so we have this problem, and I think the very first thing to look at is this federal IDEA legislation. IDEA is highly destructive, and since its implementation, public schools have grown increasingly ungovernable. The attendance numbers are dwindling rapidly in public schools all over the country as parents opt for alternatives, for charter schools, for homeschool cooperatives, for private schools, for parochial schools. And this is happening in increasing numbers faster and faster. Now, I really worked to improve public schools for a good part of my lifetime, and it was very frustrating. But at least we did what we could to keep things wired together. Public schools are going to have to restore the authority of teachers to use common sense judgment and remove violent and threatening students immediately. There doesn't need to be some precise legal standard to enable them to do this. It ought to be a common sense judgment. If a kid is a bad kid, if he's threatening, if he is inclined towards violent behavior, then get rid of him. They find reform schools and work camps. Eventually, they'll end up in the prisons, but you got to get them out before. You don't have time to let them brutalize and destroy the lives of all of the other students with them. So Abby Zwerner's case that just went to trial here in Virginia was an extreme case, but illustrative of the problems that we face in public education today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. This case in particular, I find very tragic. I mean, you're speaking of a 6-year-old boy who should not have had access to a gun. And it's all around tragic. I don't think that with the child's brain capacity at that point, you could either deem them to be evil. They don't fully understand the whole capacity of death. So to subject someone to that, to have this cognitive, premeditative thought of, okay, I'm going to bring a gun to school, I'm going to shoot my teacher, doesn't carry the same weight as I think an adult, that has that mentality, that they're thinking, understanding the finality of, what you could possibly do, which is murdering somebody. And I think that we have to take a look and account and be brutally honest with our own selves about, is our house in order? We have a school system where primarily the classrooms are overflooded. You have teachers who have to be the counselors, the parent, and then the educator, and it's taxing, and they're probably paid, $40,000 to $50,000 a year. And I would say even our culture plays into this. We have the leading cause of death for children is death by gun. And then at the same time, you inject our foreign policy. We're enabling some of the most atrocious crimes that are happening in Gaza. Our president right now is I know that we share kind of a disagreement in the drone strikes that are happening off the coast in the Caribbean, but that is a product of what our culture is right now. So I think that that is kind of something that we have to be brutally honest with and say, are we living up to the standard that we want these children to be? Nonviolent, uh, stewards of, a better nature. Are we living up to that example? We have a society where a lot of families aren't together right now. You have single parent families. You brought up New York. 1 in 7 children in New York are homeless. They don't have a home to go to. They're either living in Section 8 housing or in a church somewhere. You also have the Bronx, who majority of the children that go to public schools in the Bronx have a family member, either their parent or a close relative, that is in prison. That they don't have this organized unit. I had the pleasure of meeting he's a chess player, David McAnally, I believe. Pardon me if I got his first name wrong, but he actually taught chess in the poorest district of the country, the Bronx, to elementary school kids, and these kids developed skills that allowed them to be bankers, go into accelerating fields, actually move out of the Bronx. That program was cut. So that is one way that I feel like we cut off our nose in spite of our face when we see this program in the poorest district of our country that actually gave kids meaning, accelerated their learning process and their ability to think critically. And we just cut the program in spite of all of its productive, measures, or fruitful, how it actually produced children to leave the Bronx, go and make more money than, majority of their graduating class could ever dream of. We cut it. And so that's where I kind of come up in the situation is, ultimately we are the adults. How do we, to push on a child that they are inherently evil? I don't find any DNA tracker that you can point to and say, okay, this child's going to grow up and be an issue. So I think that I don't have the answer, but there is obviously some other element at play there. That's just kind of my 2 cents on the whole thing. And I think that this case in particular is ultimately tragic because you are talking about a 6-year-old child now who has seen images that they will carry for the rest of their life, even though, yes, they were the ones that ultimately pulled the trigger. It still kind of breaks my heart that you have this, it's all around, and the teacher as well now has to deal with this. It is a very tragic story.
Yeah. Now, the one thing on that I disagree a little bit is on the financial aspect. I think there's been this long-term push that there's not enough money going into the schools and so forth. I know that in Baltimore, I know that in Chicago, I'm familiar with those. The amount spent per student is kind of astronomical. It's just huge amounts. I think in Chicago, which has a very broken school system, I think they may be paying as much for a child to go to the first grade as they are to have a child go to a very good quality college, to attend college. So it's the massive expenditures of funds have never had any positive impact on the schools. Teachers' pay is always an issue. And, it's something, we always need to be concerned about, but even there, one thing that you do find, and this is within many of these troubled school systems, is when money is budgeted to the schools for personnel, there'll be some enormous increase in funding that's given to the schools for personnel. What typically happens is the it doesn't go into the teaching profession, it goes into the administrators.
Yeah.
So you have these very, very highly paid administrators who stay out of the classrooms where the danger is. And many of them handle the Individuals with Disabilities Act and all of the litigation and all of the programs, all of these cultural programs, rather than being on the front lines. The teachers, some of these teachers confront such enormous danger that there really is not an appropriate amount that you can pay for some of this. But the public, is very sympathetic to the idea that teachers' pay needs to be raised. But what the public does not understand is that when the legislature appropriates extravagant amounts of money for the public school personnel, it tends to always be siphoned off by these enormously bloated bureaucracies. And a lot of times, you'll have a good teacher who wants to get ahead, and they may just want to avoid violence, and they do whatever they can to get into one of these other positions so that they can get out of a classroom, survive with their life and their health intact, and then get more money and sit in an office and be finished with students. So
Yeah, I
that's
don't think we're not in any disagreement on that. I'm kind of like you. I'm speaking about the actual person that's in the classroom. I know that the money does go to a lot of the school boards and the administrative body. A lot of them get paid very handsomely. So, I'm just talking about more primarily the ones that are
sure
face to face with, the insurmountable. They have to deal with sometimes for the 40 kids. Making sure that they get from point A to point B. I mean, that's very stressful. And then, the other hats you have to wear throughout the day to, I think to show them attention to, some of the kids that need more attention than others. And so I think that's we're not in any disagreement. I think we are in agreement that that's kind of where I was coming from. Not that more money needs to be injected in schools, is that we need to find out, really take into account where the money is going. And, I know that since the Department of Education, it really hasn't raised any of our test scores. And by all accounts, we are less educated, and that is something that needs to be taken. And, we need to be critically honest with ourselves and understand the reasons why that is. So yeah, I don't think we're in any disagreement in that sector at all.
Yeah, we are going to need a certain number of people who can read and write. Mm-hmm. I'm not talking about necessarily, having higher intellectual skills, but if you can't read and if you can't do some basic arithmetic, then the ability to participate and to contribute to the culture is limited. And I think our literacy is declining. If you look at it, there's an enormous explosion of slang terms. Now, there's always been some slang. I mean, there was probably in the 1700s, there was slang, and there's always slang, and it's a little touch of spice to the language. But now you have such a proliferation of it that people don't understand most of what it says. I mean, even, I'm not talking about people who are too old to understand, but even younger people. It's like, well, what does this mean? Well, I don't know. We just say it. And it is reflective of a breakdown of intellectual precision in thought that we just, you don't quite have to understand things. You just sort of feel your way through them. And I know that there have been schools that have been rather demeaning about the idea of mathematics, that they feel like there's something wrong with the idea that there's only one correct answer to a mathematics problem. Now, the problem is if you disagree with the concept that numbers should result in a predictable outcome, you can't build a bridge, you can't design an airplane, you can't do fundamental things like let's say you want to set up a little business where um, you're in a rural area and you're taking fees for people who pay you to haul away your trash. So you don't you don't have some active genius, but you have to be able to say, okay, these 12 or 15 people want me to pick up their trash, and I'll do that on these days. But you also have to be able to say, okay, they owe me so much money, and you have to be able to write that down somewhere or type it or whatever. And you have to know when they're paying you enough and when they're not paying you enough. You have to be able to kind of add up your expenses. Okay, what does it cost me in gas money? How about the repairs for my old truck to pick this up? I'm talking the real basic kind of business. And you have to be able to add some of those and say, well, I guess I'm not charging enough because it's costing me more than I'm making. Okay, real basic things. If you can't have some really elemental grasp of numbers, and if you can't read things, then I don't care how good you feel about things, you got a big problem. You're not going to be a contributor to our culture. And I see public schools going steadily in this direction. And I think the fact that people are bailing out of public schools all over the country from coast to coast is indicative that just continuing to say I've heard the things about we don't get enough money, we don't get enough money. I've heard that for a lifetime. And I've seen that when enormous sums of money are poured into the schools, they just continue to go downhill. And that tells us that that's not the answer, that the answer is in more fundamental things. Mm-hmm. What I found, I always had a tremendous gift for managing systems and operations, whether it was loading ships or processing criminal cases or whatever it was. And one thing that I found is that rather than come up with some big global solution to everything, that what you need to do is you start with the low-hanging fruit. And when you find something that doesn't work, that is a fundamental kind of a problem, you go after that. And then you say, oh my gosh, we're making progress. And then you can pick the next things and the next things. And in that way, you can truly reform system. It's not clear that with all of the legal entanglements, federal, state, local, all of the other problems, it's not clear that we're ever going to be able to reform public schools enough to bring them to true functionality again. They used to be magnificent. I went to public schools. They were tremendous. And but in any event, we should try. As long as we've got public schools, we should try. We owe it to the children. And we need to do some fundamental things to relieve the danger to children and to teachers. So anyway, that's
Yeah.
my,
Yeah.
my
And I think more of just anecdotally speaking, in high school, I went to a magnet school for arts. Um, and at the magnet school was connected to middle school. And the middle school was primarily it was just a public middle school. Um, you could see the dichotomy of, so my classes would probably be upwards to 15 people per class.
Mhm.
And the middle school, it would be your basic, you would be your public school, 30 kids per class. Tragically, there would be middle schoolers who were pregnant, and they would be very loud, combative, and you would see this bridging of worlds where this smaller classroom where the child, I was a child in high school, got to dedicate some time of their day to something that they loved, like the craft. I was an artist. There were some theater kids or band, and they got to dedicate time to something that they truly had a love for. And so that made them eager to go to school and learn and be engaged with, their small class, and really be a good, student. Where you had the other, the middle schoolers who really were suffering in the sense of larger classrooms, the culture of, growing up way too fast. I mean, being a pregnant middle schooler is, tragic on its own. And so I think maybe that experience gives me kind of this outward look where I see that there is, you could throw money all you want at school, but I think it's more of this culture of, these larger classrooms, the plate that we put on some of these teachers to be numerous things. And that's just kind of, my last little tidbit is I think that kind of experience really opened my eyes that there is a lot more at play than, uh, you know, um, just I don't know, but I think that kind of serves a bigger purpose, that larger classrooms, some of the elements of public schools is because we're not looking for proper solutions, like smaller class sizes, giving these particular students something to do with their hands, be engaged, and dedicated time to a craft that they love. Those are just kind of my last little comments I wanted to end on. So,
Okay, well, that's great, Morgan. Well, thank you very much for this, and I appreciate you being with me on the show today.
of
And
course, thank you. And I would encourage everyone to tune in next week to focus on the news.